Okay, as promised, this is the first of a series of videos on the basic rules of the Napoleonic 20 series using the components from Fading Glory, a GMT exclusive Salamanca scenario here out on the table, along with a mess of counters that I need to sort through, my photocopied rule set, as well as the various charts and tables. Today we're going to be talking about movement. Okay, here's a look at the map with the counters from the scenario, the Salamanca scenario, placed randomly about. A closer look at each of the counters. A unit represents roughly a division to a corps of men, of troops. And each hex is about a half a mile to a mile in distance across. So I was able to estimate my daily commute to work as being roughly the same distance as, I think it was Calaverasa de Arriba, to taking this road. Oops, that's my keyboard. Over the river and through the woods to Salamanca. Not too bad as long as I leave after traffic. Yeah. Taking a look at this guy right here in the middle, he would be, this is 1st Corps Infantry. Two values here in the lower right. The first number is the combat value, combat strength, so this unit has a combat strength of 4, and the second number is the movement allowance. If you consult your handy-dandy terrain effects chart, you'll see the movement costs of each terrain type. Generally speaking, to enter an empty hex, it would cost you 1 movement point. The terrain effects chart will tell you, under the movement column, any exceptions to that rule. A couple of important ones are the rugged terrain, which include rough terrain and forest terrain hexes. When a unit enters one of these types of hexes, they must immediately stop and forego any remaining movement points, which are not carried over from turn to turn. They're just lost. So if you were here, you would not be able to make it to hex 13, 14, 1314, going through the forest. The exception to this rule is if there is actually a road that goes through rugged terrain, in which case the road takes precedence and allows you to pass through it freely without getting stopped. So for 2 movement points, this unit would be able to reach hex 1711, going through the forest via this road. Under Rule 6.5, rugged terrain, marshes are also mentioned, but I don't find, I can't find it on the terrain effects chart, nor in the Salamanca scenario. So if we do come across it in another scenario, be aware that that is also considered rugged terrain and will stop you immediately upon entering. If you're traveling along a road, you get a bonus of +1 to your movement allowance as long as your entire movement is along the same road. So this unit, with its 2 movement points, would be able to move 1, 2, better yet, 1, 2 to this junction, and then get a +1 to its movement allowance, pushing it up to Aldea Tejada. Movement upslope, as I'd mentioned, does have an effect to the movement cost. To move upslope, to cross this upslope hex side, costs a +1 movement point in this direction only. So this is the lower ground and this is the higher ground. So what would normally cost 1 movement point, because there's a slope there, now costs 2, and that would be your entire movement for that turn if you're using this unit. However, going in the opposite direction, downslope, does not add to the movement cost. So from here you would be able to run down this hill and then move into this hex, for example. There are 2 types of rivers: major rivers, there's thicker rivers, and minor rivers. Major rivers are impassable unless they have some sort of a ford or bridge running across it. So for example, a unit in this hex is pretty much stuck there in that corner, not able to cross this major river. Minor rivers, on the other hand, as you've guessed probably, are passable for a +1 movement point cost. So to get from hex 202 to 203, it would cost 1 + 1, 2 movement points, and that would end this guy's turn right here, for example. All roads crossing rivers are considered bridges, whether or not you see these 2 black lines surrounding it. That's one thing that I noticed in some clarification that I read online from one of the designers. Bridges make it so that you do not have to pay the +1 extra movement cost to cross a river. To get from here, hex 111 to 110 would only cost 1 movement point. Whereas to get from hex 211 to 210, that would cost 2 movement points. An extra movement point for crossing a river, a minor river, where there is no bridge. There are also things called pontoon bridges that behave much the same way as regular bridges, that they make it so that you can cross a major river with no added movement cost. The third and final type of river crossing is the ford. This also behaves in much the same way as bridges as bridges. This makes it so you can actually cross this major river. So for example, you can get from the forest, crossing the Rio Tormes via this ford into Santa Marta. 1, 2. I mentioned fortified hexes when I was talking about the fortified city of Salamanca. That only costs 1 movement point to enter, much like regular open terrain or town hexes. There's also a similarly protected hex called a redoubt hex, and that behaves much the same way as a fortified hex as far as movement is concerned. It costs 1 movement point to enter. These types of hexes really only distinguish themselves from open terrain in the combat phase, not so much in the movement phase. You'll notice that some hexes are marked with some sort of rimmed with triangular edges of color, denoting that it's some sort of objective hex, not necessarily a different terrain type. Same goes for the line of communication hex and the setup hex, as well as unit arrival locations, which typically border the map, and which is where our first units arrive in this scenario, and where any further reinforcements would arrive. So in summary, it generally costs 1 movement point to enter an adjacent hex. Some exceptions include the inability to cross over major rivers, unless there is some sort of bridge or ford, slopes, upslopes, and minor rivers where there are no bridges costs an extra +1 movement point to cross. Any rough terrain and forest terrain, rough, forest, stops movement immediately upon entering. And then finally, if you move along a road and your entire movement is along a road, you get a +1 bonus to your movement allowance. And then finally, but most probably more importantly, there's no stacking in this game. None of this, which is nice. Instead, what you can do is move through friendly units to get where you're going. 1, 2. But you cannot end your movement on a hex containing a friendly unit. So something like this would not be legal. There are other special cases that take into account zone of control, which we'll talk about next. Totally unrelated cameo. Yeah, so I think I'll move the end this video here and talk about zones of control in a separate video, which is definitely mandatory viewing if you want to get the whole view on, to get all the little rules and related to movement.